Hi, colleagues. Wonderful to see you all, and thank you so much for joining us on looking at this important issue around inclusive classrooms and approaches to it. So, thank you very, very much for joining us. I'm just going to give it just a few minutes, and then we will get started. But again, really wonderful to have you join us today, and thank you so much wherever you are in the country. Um, as I say, thank you so much for joining us. Um, my name's Ruben Moore. I'm the Executive Director of Programs here at the National Institute of Teaching, and other colleagues will introduce themselves as they begin their part of the session. I'm just going to do a little bit of kind of chairing, sort of as we begin. Colleagues, as I say, you're very, very welcome. And please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. There will be question and answer sort of at the end. We'll give enough time for that. I'll make sure that we have enough time for that, and therefore I'll either save the questions and kind of pose them out to the team as we go, or if there's something pertinent, I might just sort of throw it in as we're going through the process. So thanks, maybe Stephen. Can you kind of click on to the next slide, please? Smashing. So, for those of you, many of you will be familiar with the National Institute of Teaching, but again, for those of who are not, we were founded by a number of multi-academy trusts, and there they are on the left-hand side. And we also have a large network of associate colleges as well. So, to provide us sort of with a national reach, working in close partnership with many schools, universities, SCITs, and other training and development organisations to kind of contribute to this important work about making sure that our children thrive in our schools and that our teachers and leaders are nurtured to support all children. And the next slide, please. Thanks. So again, I've sort of given a little of a sort of bit of a pre sort of piece in terms of what we are about. The National Institute is about that issue of nurturing the talents of teachers and leaders at every stage. Again, we want teachers to thrive so that their pupils can thrive as well, and that includes development, that includes protection, it includes support. But our real focus is absolutely on all children. And again, it's very pertinent for our discussion today, especially around inclusive classrooms. And then the mission, how we do this, is about improving the quality of teacher and leader development at a system level. So therefore, we develop programs, we run programs, but also we want to share what we're learning, including the generation and interpretation of research and sharing them widely with the sector. And this is an example of doing so. And I think hopefully, as you'll hear going through it, we certainly don't think we have all the answers. I don't think anybody does or has. I wish somebody did. But I think we are all searching for what are the best evidence-informed kind of approaches that we can use to really ensure that every child gets the excellent education that they deserve, and therefore we play our part, as do many colleagues on this call, and in the wider sector as well, around that contribution to supporting all of our children to be successful. Thanks. And the next slide. And as I said, I think I've talked about that already, but I think the kind of the nature of what we do is bringing together that research and practice. So therefore, as I've said, we're sort of learning as we go, and I think that's so important, especially navigating complex waters, such as this, such as the work, and such as ensuring that every child is successful in our school, and that our teachers and leaders can support them with the best possible methods to do so. Again, these things are, many of them are not straightforward, and therefore the importance of being research informed, research underpinned in many many senses. And also, I think we're absolutely about thinking about these things, learning and reflecting, and then improving our work, but also in sharing both the learning and the reflections with this wider sector. So therefore, you're going to find out a little bit about our two research projects. And again, you'll have the chance to sort of ask questions both of those colleagues involved in the research of this, but also those colleagues involved in the practice in terms of how that was developed. And again, I'll introduce them as they come in. Thanks. And the next slide. Great. So I think I'm going to hand over to Lydia.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ruben. And hi, everyone. My name is Lydia Limperis. I'm a research fellow at the National Institute of Teaching, and I was also a study co-leading on the sort of impact evaluation or the trial component of the study that we're going to talk about today. Right, so why is high quality training for inclusive grouping important? That is important. That was a key theme of the study that we are talking about today. And I think we can all agree that today's classrooms are more diverse than ever. In England, we now have over 1.6 million pupils. That's about 18% of all students who are identified with special educational needs or disabilities, and the number of pupils with education, health, and care plans keeps rising. However, the decisions that teachers make every day are not shaped by pupil needs alone. The teachers are juggling a whole mix of influences, and that includes budget pressures, attendance challenges, workload, school policies, and of course, the lingering effects of the pandemic, to name just a few. So when we talk about inclusive practice, and that includes inclusive grouping, we can't really treat it as a standalone strategy that operates at a classroom level. We need to acknowledge that it always plays out within a particular context. So what is possible and what works depends on the realities of that classroom, but also the ecosystem around it. And trainees need to be able to make sense of this bigger picture. They need to feel prepared and confident to navigate all these moving parts so that their decision-making is informed, it's principled, it's intentional, and ultimately they are well equipped to support all the students to learn and participate and thrive. So this was the premise on which this study was developed. So when we talk about inclusive grouping, we're simply talking about arranging pupils, two or more working together in ways that aim to maximize everyone's opportunity to participate, to learn, no matter their ability, their attainment, their background, or their needs. And the reason that this is really important, and we thought that this really, really matters, is that grouping is not just a logistical choice. It can actually shape who participates, who gets access to what kinds of learning, and ultimately who makes progress. That's why inclusive grouping is considered such a high leverage mechanism. And this is something that's explicitly recognized within the ITT ECF as well. And one way of putting this into practice is through flexible grouping, whereby groups are not fixed, they're temporary, they're dynamic, they change with the task, they change depending on the specific learning objective, or even depending on the evolving student needs. There is now evidence to support the idea that when teachers use mixed or homogeneous or more similar groupings purposefully, they can really support a wide range of learners. So this is really a high leverage area, which is really quite important in the classroom when we talk about inclusion. Now, the bad news is that flexible grouping is not straightforward. These decisions are, again, shaped by all sorts of moving parts. Teachers are expected to weigh up academic, social, emotional, behavioral needs, And they're also navigating peer relationships, school policies, parental expectations, the resources that they have to work with, all these things. It's a very complex picture. So flexible grouping can be powerful, but it also sits within a really complex decision-making space. And that complexity is exactly what led us to the inclusive practice trial. Running in the academic year 24-25, the study looked at essentially how we can support trainees to build the confidence and the practical skill they need to make flexible, dynamic, and responsive sort of grouping decisions in the classroom, right? So that was the focus of this particular study. So what did we do precisely? Right, so these are two separate approaches. And what we did was we compared two different ways of preparing trainees to make those grouping decisions at the classroom level. So approach A on the left-hand side focused very much on practical strategies. So giving trainees concrete sort of techniques that they could try out and refine in the classroom. And this included things such as structuring mixed groups or similar groups to provide targeted support, then monitor the groups and identify different ways of monitoring how the groups are doing, and then adapt their groupings based on, again, the specific learning goals, the evolving needs, monitoring interactions, how the dynamics are, and make those decisions based on the data that they were collecting as they monitored how the groupings worked. So the emphasis was very much on applied classroom level practice. Now, approach B, on the other hand, took sort of a step back and looked at the bigger picture. So a more systems thinking perspective. Rather than looking only at what happens inside the classroom, this approach was designed and aimed to encourage trainees to consider the wider web of influences on grouping decisions. So they were thinking about all those things that I mentioned earlier, school policies. They were thinking about leadership priorities, potentially parental expectations, the resources available, all these things, right, as part of that classroom and school ecosystem. And the idea was that, again, grouping choices are never made in isolation. They are shaped by, but also feedback into the broader system. Importantly, we were not positioning one approach as better than the other. All trainees received some foundational input on grouping strategies, and I'll talk about what the training looked like in a minute. So there was a sort of common foundation, but the real question was, given that shared foundation across both groups, does adding more targeted classroom-based training actually make a meaningful difference? Or does additional training that builds trainees' wider contextual awareness, does that have a stronger impact? So what we really wanted to do was, I suppose, better understand the strengths and limitations of each approach in achieving the training outcomes that we're interested in around grouping decisions in the classroom. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what the training looked like on the day. Okay, so I know this looks very complex, but I'm going to talk you through it. So the training took place in a single day. There were 5 sessions within the training for both groups. Both groups started with the same foundation, that's session 1 and session 2. Session 1 was very much about setting the scene, just going over the aims of the day and getting a baseline of trainees' starting points. Then session 2, it was about sort of building, again, shared knowledge by reviewing ways to support pupils' needs and pupils' diverse needs and how to approach group work effectively. So again, it was about establishing that shared foundation across both groups around approaches to group work at the classroom level. Now, session 3 was when the two pathways for each group diverged. Um, so this is where we have approach A and approach B. For the practical strategies group, the focus was very much on developing those classroom-ready grouping techniques that I talked about earlier. So trainees really worked on strategies that they could use straight away. They talked about dynamic and flexible grouping, scaffolding, so how to scaffold the group interactions, and ways of using oracy to make group work more effective. And again, the aim was to strengthen the practical sort of toolkit, so to speak. Approach B, on the other hand, for session 3, this group did something different. They shifted to a wider, more conceptual view. And what trainees did in this group was they basically spent time exploring the broader system that shapes inclusive practice. And that included SEND policy, again, talking about the role and the expectations and the perspectives of different stakeholders, parents, governors, colleagues, different kinds of colleagues and groups within the school ecosystem, as well as elements of the inclusive sort of toolkit. And again, the idea was to help trainees understand the context in which grouping decisions are made. So it was shifting a little bit higher up and taking a wider angle sort of view. After session 3, both groups followed the same format again. They're still separately in separate sessions, but the format is again the same. So session 4 was about applying that learning through scenarios and deliberate practice. And then session 5, they wrapped up the day with some reflection and some key takeaways. So this is an overview of what the training looked like for each group and really where the key divergence, where the key point of intervention occurred. I will now hand over to Rasheen, who will share a few snapshots of the resources from each approach, just so that we contextualize things a little bit more. Rasheen, over to you.
Thanks, Lydia. Hi, everyone. So I'm Roisin Ellison, and I'm a research fellow at the National Institute of Teaching and a co-lead investigator on the study alongside Lydia. So I'll be going through some of the resources from the training. This resource we're highlighting is a slide taken from the slide pack, and it highlights the key takeaways from the training. So this was for both groups, and it was referred back to throughout. The training referred to the content and tasks which focused on understanding the what and the how to of these 5 statements. And these 5 statements were taken from the ITT ECF framework. So the training looked like how they might work in practice, while keeping in mind that what works best will depend on classroom context. So the next resource comes from the practical strategies training. This task focused on whole school strategies. It encouraged trainees to think beyond individual groups and consider how learners can access the same lesson, with the key idea being around planning connected activities that included everyone, rather than designing separate tasks that single pupils out. So trainees applied this to a PSHE context. They explored ways of introducing key terms so all learners could participate. For example, a strategy such as modelling language aloud, so pupils needing support can follow, while allowing those ready for challenge to extend their thinking. The next resource is based on the systems thinking approach. So this activity was designed to help trainees see how different factors can shape a child's experience of school. So trainees started by looking at how schools operate and how various people and groups interact within that setting. They explored the different layers of influence from staff and students to families and organisations outside of the school. So the goal here was to give trainees a clearer sense of just how many relationships and pressures make up a school's ecosystem and how all of these elements come together to affect children's experiences of education and of their school. We've got a final resource then from systems thinking as well, which builds on the previous activity. And this shifts the focus to grouping decisions for children with SEN. So trainees used Brenner's ecological framework to map out the different stakeholders involved in decisions and considering their various levels of influence. So they filled out the table that you see on the right-hand side. They identified stakeholders, the kind of influence that they have, and how that might affect the learner. So the aim here was to encourage trainees to think ahead about how broader systemic factors can shape what happens in the classroom and use that understanding to think about making more thoughtful, inclusive grouping choices for children with SEN. Okay, handing back over to Lydia now.
Thanks, Roisin. Great. So what did we find, right? This is really the meat of this presentation. What came out of this study? A few words about the methods before we actually go there. So what we did was we worked with 250 secondary trainees across 6 NIOT training sites in England, who were randomly assigned to one of the 2 approaches. The training took place in May 25, so just a few months ago. And we collected data in several ways, including through motivation and self-efficacy scales, scenario-based assessments. We conducted surveys with trainees and also tutors, and similarly interviews and focus groups with tutors and trainees. And we also conducted session observations. And that was, again, to capture an as rich a picture as possible of how the training was experienced and how it was implemented. I will say that the analysis of the scenarios, the scenario-based assessments is still ongoing. So we will not be reporting on these today, but we will be sharing those findings in due course. Right, okay. I'm going to be brief presenting this slide. So the question is really, did one training approach work better than the other? The headline, when we look at the trial results, right, this is looking at just the self-efficacy and the motivation scales. And the headline is that we didn't really find any significant differences between the 2 training approaches, which means that trainees, oops, you can see the slides moving. Sorry. Next slide, please. Yes, we're here. Great, thank you. Oops. Brilliant, thank you. So where the trainees experience sort of the big pictures systems thinking model or the classroom focused practical strategies model, we effectively saw very similar outcomes in terms of things such as their self-efficacy, their motivation, and their intentions to implement and sustain inclusive grouping practices, which was really interesting in and of itself. Like I said, this is only part of the picture. The analysis is still ongoing. However, what these findings are not telling us is they're not really telling us much about how the training actually unfolded in practice, for which I am now going to hand over back to Roisin, who is going to share some really, really interesting insights that emerge from the process evaluation. So the qualitative sort of mostly qualitative data collection analysis. So Roisin, over to you.
Thanks, Lydia. So when we looked at trainees' experiences, we saw that each approach had clear strengths, but they also had some limitations. So on the left-hand side, you can see the practical strategies group. These trainees appreciated how immediately transferable the content felt. Because it built on things they already knew, the strategies were easy to picture and apply in the classroom setting. However, this familiarity also meant the learning sometimes remained at quite a high level focus. So that narrower high level focus on classroom techniques gave fewer opportunities for deeper reflection or for questioning underlying assumptions about inclusion. Then on the right hand side, we've got big picture systems thinking. So for trainees here, the learning sometimes felt more transformative when they were exploring the wider landscape. So when they were learning about national SEN policies, historical developments over time, and the perspectives of different stakeholders, such as parents, it prompted them to rethink aspects of their practice and beliefs around inclusion. But this approach also came with challenges, so the content could feel abstract, less directly applicable, and the more conceptual material created a higher cognitive load. As a result, trainees didn't always make that link between the ideas that they learn on the day and day-to-day grouping decisions. However, across both approaches, what really stood out was that both trainees and tutors recognised the genuine value in each of these approaches, but in different ways. And when asked which they would recommend for new trainees, the most common response was that both approaches would be needed in a training year for trainees. So moving on to some quotes that reflect the experiences of trainees. We've got a quote on the left, which is from a focus group with a trainee who did the practical strategies approach, and I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to read that. So here, the trainee talks through how they can actively shape how students interact by thoughtfully organising groups using their understanding of each student's behaviour. So this highlights how the training supported the trainee to think about grouping strategies for the next day in their school. As you can see, they say having this training was very helpful in deciding those groups for tomorrow. Then we've got a quote on the right-hand side that's from a trainee interview for the systems thinking approach. And again, I'll just give you 30 seconds to read that. So what this quote is showing is a trainee's perspective shifting from seeing schools as teaching the same thing to appreciating the unique ways of each school. So it's not just about students and teachers as well, but thinking about externally, parents, external organisations. And they also say that the stronger the connections are, the better the school, really the better quality of education. So each quote is showing us the benefits of the training approaches, and both quotes together illustrate the importance of training for inclusive awareness at multiple levels. So what we're now looking at is mapping the curriculum focus to the learning outcomes. So we've got a quadrant here that summarises the patterns that I've just discussed from the qualitative data. The vertical axis represents content type. So at the bottom, we have immediately transferable, and then those are strategies that trainees can use in the classroom straight away. And then at the top, we've got conceptual, theoretical, so the big picture ideas, the policies, learning about systems. We've then got the horizontal axis, and that represents the type of thinking. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the deep reflective thinking, so reflecting about beliefs and assumptions around inclusion and around practice. And then on the right-hand side, we've got practical applied thinking. So this illustrates both of these approaches in a design space. And what we found is that trainees valued both ends of the axis. So what that means is they viewed them as complementary rather than competing. When we first designed this intervention, our question was, with available curriculum time being limited, what should we be prioritising and why? So our early findings here suggest a more helpful way to think about this is not choosing one approach over another to prioritise, but actually integrating them thoughtfully so they contribute to a coherent learning journey for trainees. So integrating the two approaches, as recommended by participants, means deliberately designing the sessions that span the full width and height of the diagram. So that would mean also combining practical application and immediate transferability with deeper reflection, as well as opportunities to be learning theory, so learning systems theory, but then being able to have an opportunity to apply that in real world contexts. So we also found that the way the training was sequenced, interleaved, and personalised really mattered to trainees, and tutors agreed, often recommending these elements as well. For example, some trainees suggested starting with a broad systems thinking overview, so the why, and they thought that would set the context and spark engagement. And they then felt that moving into a practical scenario-based activity, so the how, would give them tools that they could use right away in the classroom, which was really important to them. And then they felt that building in opportunities for deliberate practice and peer feedback would also help consolidate their learning. Importantly, they didn't think of this as just a one-off sequence. Both trainees and tutors highlighted the value of interleaving. So that is revisiting key ideas and skills throughout the year rather than just covering them once, moving on. So it would involve coming back to concepts like inclusion and systems thinking in different contexts. So that would help deepen understanding and build long-term confidence in applying them. And then we've got the second bullet point here about personalising for learner readiness. So our survey and interview data showed mixed views on the timing of the training. Trainees that had less experience in the education sector were less likely to feel the training came at the right point of the year. So to put it kind of more simply, it suggests that when trainees have less experience, they'd benefit from more foundational support and more context. They need more support to understand these ideas. So if the session comes too early or too late, it can be hard to engage or apply that training. So really tailoring the timing to match the trainee's prior experience would help make it more engaging and relevant for them. So we've already said that this is not an either or. And at the NAOT, we've been discussing these findings internally. It's prompted us to think, for example, how could we personalise for learner readiness? Could we have self-study components, like a module on SEND history and policy that trainees could explore independently? Could we have optional pre-course readings that might support less experienced trainees as well? These are the kind of things that we've been having discussions about. So in the next section, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So how might you apply these approaches in your context? And at this point, I will hand back over to Ruben.
Thanks so much, Roisin and Lydia. Really, really useful setup there. And again, just to sort of go through both the process that was followed, the resources used, and some of those kind of initial findings which have prompted sort of that greater thinking. Um, and again, it just feels like that there's something really valuable going on here in terms of what that big thinking is and then how that applies into practice. And sort of I think that there's a real sort of symbiosis there in terms of both of those things, sort of, and it's interesting to see that come out. Right, colleagues, I'm going to move us on to the next slide, and hopefully you'll be able to get your phones out if you can. So therefore, you can either capture you can take a picture of that, and it comes up the QR code, and it'll take you to a Mentimeter, or you can join at menti.com and use the code 7170052. And again, just it'd be great to hear your reflections. And what we'll do is we'll try and show that as they build. And I know there's some questions coming through now, but also I'll do sort of add any questions that you have, and I'm getting ready to pose those to the team. So what we'll do, we'll give a few more. A few more sort of moments to capture your thoughts, and then we'll see what some of the results have been, and then I'll pose some of these great questions that are in the chat. Wow, two big ones.
Given, hopefully you can all see my screen.
Yes, yes, we can, Lydia, and these are coming through now. So some pretty big reflections there. I think it's fair to say, in terms of challenging a system, the wider implications, these sorts of things, but also thinking of kind of what scholarship really means, and sort of the provoking lots of sort of thoughts in that. Um, Again, interesting the kind of long-term impact that we're starting to see. Okay, great. I'll just give it one more moment, and then we'll go to questions. Okay, shift in attitudes. Interesting. Interesting. Okay, interactive, right? Okay, really interesting. Okay, thank you. So we'll again do kind of keep adding your thoughts as we go. We'll take this one down, but I'll sort of we'll pose a few questions and then see where we get to. So I wonder if I could bring in Nicole and Pete at this stage, and again, if the two of you could introduce yourselves. There was a question around kind of how did we do the deliberate practice aspect? Like, what did that look like? One of the colleagues on the call would like to sort of find out a bit more about that. So, Nicole, I wonder, could you kick us off then, and then maybe Pete could come in after that?
Sure, not a problem. So I was with the Purple Group, which was more focused on sort of like the stakeholder elements and looking at like different provisions within the school in terms of SND, SLT, parents, and just thinking about that. So that's the lens through which my group was looking at. In terms of the deliberate practice, they were giving a very specific scenario. So they were taking over a particular class. They were told about the different needs of the class, and then had to think about how they might group these children, or students actually, in terms of like a lesson planning and seat planning and where they would place them. And then once they'd kind of sort of developed their lesson plan or their seating plan for where they were going to put particular students based on their needs, what they would then look at doing is looking at that through the lens of different stakeholders. So if a parent was looking at this, how would they interpret that seating plan? Parents maybe would come back with questions. Why has my child been chosen to sit in this particular seat? If it was looking at the lens through governor, for example, who was doing a school visit or a school tour, what might they say about the particular sort of like grouping that you've done as well? So that's kind of a little bit of an overview. Peter, I don't know if you wanted to add anything additional to that.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I mean, I did the same group, so I had the pleasure of supporting a
Brilliant.
purple group too. The only thing I'd add is that what was interesting about some of that practice and those contexts that Nicole's just described in terms of looking through the lens of a parent or a carer or a governor, is some consideration then of kind of a response. So kind of preempting or considering how a parent or a governor might react, and then what your response to that could be. So continuing that lens of kind of system thinking that came through the quote earlier on, beyond their own classroom. I certainly found with the small group I had that they were really engaged with beginning to consider some of these situations and these bits of practice through those different lenses. Was certainly one of the things that I noted when I was facilitating. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you. That really useful to hear, and really a great question in terms of sort of deliberate practice. And I think we use just for the colleague who sort of asked the question, we use deliberate practice as kind of one of the sort of cornerstones of our work. And I think one of the key things that we find within deliberate practice is, as exactly colleagues have said, giving trainees a scenario, giving them some sort of a real life example, and then giving them some success criteria that then other colleagues can feed back to them on the relative success, and then get them to sort of practice that. I think that these are sort of some of the sort of finding stones of deliberate practice, and we find it, incredibly useful, as well as that sort of, as well as perhaps the systems thinking aspect in terms of raising those wider considerations and then how they can put that into practice. Really useful. Thank you for that. So the next question then was from Tara, It's at a granular level. Oh, sort of. So we've talked about that already. So Tara, thank you. Hopefully, we've answered that in terms of what did the two approaches look like in the classroom setting and the sort of planning stage. So I think you've talked about the sort of the B group there, and then I think the A group again was a sort of these are the sort of different sort of methods by which we could do it, and then they were kind of learning about those different approaches, sort of in a quite a practical way to be able to kind of outline those as Roisin has alluded to. There was then a question about have what are our thoughts on systematically integrating centre-based practice with those in the placement school. And again, I think it's a great question, and certainly from my perspective, I know that that's been a real thrust of the ITT sort of accreditation in terms of, and especially intensive training and practice, as many of you will know about how we bring these sort of center-based and practice-based elements together. I'm just wondering, Pete, do you want to sort of say anything about that, about how we do that? Maybe not necessarily even in this trial, but kind of how we bring together those sort of two elements.
Sure, very, very happy to. So practically what that process might look like for a trainee is that following on from the kind of core delivery of our core training, trainees will be assigned a specific bit of learning and an action step to take forward into their schools and into their classrooms, following on from that training. And that might be something very specific about their practice that reflects what they've learned and engaged with in training, but also be some ongoing learning and opportunities to go and explore, the expertise that will exist back in their school placement, for example, particularly in the context of this study that we're discussing today. One of the final elements of the day included an opportunity for a bit of modelled practice from the facilitator, and then some practice from each trainee where they selected a lesson, they brought it back to their context of their school that they were teaching the next week. They considered the objective, they considered how group work might feature within that particular context, and then designed some activities to then take forward into the following kind of week's worth of practice and teaching. So that was at the end of the training, an opportunity for them to really contextualize their thinking and consider their own teaching that was to come in the following days.
Really useful. Thanks so much, Pete. So there's a question from Claire. Are there any plans for a follow-up with participants to explore the impact longer term? So, Roisin or Lydia, do you want to sort of to sort of kick us off on that one?
Thanks, Ruben. Yeah, so we've actually just completed follow-up interviews with two ECTs. So we did a call out and we were hoping for more responses, but we did get two ECTs and we've just interviewed them. They were both in the systems thinking group. And although we haven't done data analysis on them yet, in general, what was interesting is that one participant didn't really remember the training, but was able to talk about inclusive grouping and flexible grouping in the classroom. So even though what I've presented today, it looked like that link between the systems thinking and inclusive grouping was a difficult one to make. Further down the line, it does show that there was evidence that they were able to recall some of that information and put it into practice. And we had a second ECT who remembered the training very well and found it a very kind of powerful element of their training year. So obviously we're looking forward to doing the data analysis on those in more detail, but those are preliminary findings so far.
Great, and I'm sure those preliminary findings have a bit of a health warning with them, Roisin, for the moment. But again, interesting to hear that in terms of because it's so important, isn't it, in terms of what's remembered at the time, and then how they know how trainee teachers, how any of us take it into sort of longer term impact. Thanks for that. We'll have a question then from Liz, and maybe I'll come to Nicole for this one as well, and Pete, but feel free to come in. Do you think that this type of integrated approach can apply across other areas of teacher training? So therefore, we've used it in particular in inclusive practice. But are there other areas that this might lend itself to? And again, Liz has sort of said in terms of that kind of using the systems thinking and sort of more, in Liz's words, sort of operational strategies in terms of that. So, Nicole, do you want to kick us off there? You're at the center of this work. So, what do you think?
Absolutely. Like I do think the systematic lens is something that is really important for our trainees to have that understanding of. Leading that group, it was really interesting to see the trainees who have quite a good understanding of what the systems look like in schools, and the ones that have less experience in schools, maybe they're fee paying and they haven't worked in schools for as long, fee paying trainees, sorry, who maybe have less experience. And they were kind of a novice to actually what was meant in terms of stakeholders. So I do think you could look at that kind of those two different lenses in terms of being more systematic or looking at stakeholders in different areas. And just actually, one of the benefits of that could be to actually broaden our trainees' understanding of actually that whole school ethos. I think one of the quotes that was presented today talked about how it made them understand more about that role of SLT and governors and that wider role within schools and how that contributes to a school culture. I think that's something that maybe as a whole school approach is something we could potentially talk about more and apply it to other areas, whether that's looking at assessment, whether that's looking at different types of, like, I'm trying to think of another area off the top of my head, but whether that is, for example, assessment and why schools choose to do assessment in particular ways. Is that because of the stakeholder lens as well? So I do think you could apply it to other areas, but at the very least, it would broaden the trainees' understanding that school is not just about your classroom. There's actually a much wider community that goes on, and it's important to understand what that culture is as you progress through your ECT years and potentially onto being middle leaders. I think that's good to kind of think about in terms of where they see themselves as well.
A really interesting, Nicole, because again, I think I wrestle sometimes with this to say, no, to what extent do we kind of do we do we make things more complex when those colleagues are trying to sort of take those sort of first steps? But in the same way, I think the kind of the novice teachers or new teachers having an understanding of different approaches, I think really helps deepen their own knowledge and helps them be able to reflect more deeply on their practice. Because I think it can be very sort of simple sometimes to kind of just see the superficial and go, oh, well, yes, they do it wrongly or they do it well or whatever. We have these kind of slight sort of pantomime
Yeah.
versions where actually that kind of systems thinking can help us kind of understand the difference and then kind of make those sort of more judicious decisions sort of in their career, whether it's in that first year or whether, as you say, Nicole, as they kind of go through the system.
And I think where we choose to place it as well. So this was carried out in May, where actually the
Mm.
trainees were quite towards the end of their journey, whereas in September, I think it would have had much less impact because they're actually still struggling with behaviour and routines at that point and actually managing the classroom. And maybe another thought would be whether it's more included in sort of the ECT framework as well. Is that something that we're moving into as they start to develop their practice?
No, a great point because I think the kind of the sequencing of these things, I think if we've learnt so much as a system about the importance of kind of sequencing for especially those that are new to teaching. Great, thanks so much, Nicole. We've a question from Russell here, and Lydia, I'll come to you, I think. Did the analysis of initial findings indicate how confident trainees feel about putting the strategies highlighted into their placement practice?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Russell. Great question. I will say that we didn't ask trainees specifically about placement practices, so we didn't specify that in the data collection. But I think we might be able to extrapolate from what we did ask more generally about the motivation to implement inclusive grouping and their self-efficacy in doing so. And we do actually have a very interesting pattern going on whereby even though trainees are reported experiencing quite sort of different types of learning, we've talked about the immediate application of strategies versus that kind of transformative reflection and shifts in beliefs about inclusion and what that really means. Quantitatively, they felt, or we found that they felt equally self-efficacious or capable across both domains. And we really have been sort of scratching our heads, and we've been, coming together as a team and trying to make sense of that sort of almost discrepancy. So how can we actually explain it? And what this, given that the quantitative data didn't really point to any difference between the two groups, and what this really seems to suggest to us is that the sort of the source and the nature of confidence differs, or across the two groups, or that there might be some sort of interaction between the two types of training. So even if one group focused on sort of the practical strategies and the other on the systems thinking, both of them could report the similar confidence across both domains. So on the whole, you get similar scores on the scale, because it kind of does not really capture that nuanced, very specific self-efficacy that seems to be coming out of the qualitative data. And this is really how we have sort of, this is what this discrepancy suggests to us, which is really, if there is an overlap across the two training approaches, it becomes even more interesting, because all this conversation that we have been having around integration, sequencing, interleaving, this becomes even more important when we think about the two training approaches as overlapping or interacting with one another.
Hmm. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much for both the questions and indeed the answers. I think we have time for one more. If there's a sort of final question that any colleagues have, we can maybe squeeze that one in. But I just think this particular topic is so interesting. We know the centrality that that ensuring all of our pupils are included in the classroom is on the minds of so many teachers and leaders, and has been for many years, but certainly has come into even sharper focus as we await the white paper to be published, in no doubt in the coming months, which will sort of set a view from in terms of where we go with this. But I think nevertheless, in terms of today, this kind of getting how we really can kind of consider, it's about judicious thought. Teachers have to make big decisions, hundreds of them in a single lesson often. And therefore, it's about how they can make the best informed decisions. And then, but also can kind of apply those decisions in their classroom. So the kind of thinking about it and then doing it, I think, is somewhat so sort of fundamental to the work of all teachers and indeed of all leaders. And I think what this research shows, and again, but I think positively to say that both are needed, and therefore it's about kind of when are certain things needed, when are certain other aspects needed, and how do we get the blend right so that we don't overwhelm, so that we don't kind of sort of make it too simplistic. And I think Roisin, I think you talked earlier about kind of finding that those kind of personalized responses at certain times, dependent on a trainee's particular context, their background, whatever that might be, I think can be really valuable. We can start to weigh these particular elements in that much detail. So I think there were a few final things in the chat, and I think particularly for Lydia and Roisin, about kind of what the where sort of this goes next. And I think it was the colleagues were talking about, is there an intention to publish this? And I think I know that, I'm sure that will be a sort of consideration, but I think nevertheless, I think our underpinning sort of principle at the National Institute of Teaching is to kind of share widely with the sector in various formats. So this webinar is one of them, and we very much believe in the kind of sharing of our sort of findings as we see them, rather than kind of the sort of very end result. So therefore, again, it was great to hear Roisin and Lydia sort of talk about, this is what we've found out so far, but we're still kind of analysing these things, because I think it's important to kind of that we can show our working out as we're doing it, as well as sort of at the end. But Lydia, Roisin, are there, do you know yet, are there any sort of plans to sort of publish more widely? Lydia, you come off mute there, so far away.
Ready, ready to answer that. Yes, absolutely echo everything that you have already said, Ruben, but more concretely, yes, this is hot off the press. So we've not been able to report on all of the outcomes today. However, we will be following it up, but we are trying to sort of tailor the different outputs to different audiences, as Ruben has just said. So just stay tuned is what I can say for now. We will be producing more outputs in different formats for again, different audiences, but we're also working on publishing our results in sort of academic outputs as well in the form of papers, which is a little bit further down the line, but it's going to be a very busy next few months. So it is coming in the next few months for sure.
Great, really great to hear. Because again, this is, and we know that it's interesting you say about different formats because we know we want to kind of make sure that we can share it with the sector. We know teachers and leaders are so busy and therefore trying to get it into their hands. What is the sort of best way to do so? So again, we'll look forward to that and thanks very much. And on which note, colleagues, before I sort of say a real heartfelt thank you to you all, if you do want to kind of keep in touch with us, there's a newsletter that goes out from ourselves or register for future events at the National Institute of Teaching. Please kind of scan the QR code and you can kind of join us there or keep in touch with us or keep up to date with what's going on. We also have our website where we publish all of our research. And again, on that website, to my point earlier, you can see kind of our processes where we are. Either we've just begun a piece of research, or we're in the middle of it, or we have completed it and published. And you can see all of the different stages of the process in a sort of very usable format there on the website. And then there is an email address. And there's also some individuals there, two of whom, Lydia and Roisin, you've met today. And again, always useful to sort of show the underpinning evidence on which we base our work, as well as hopefully both synthesizing and generating new research that sits alongside these particular issues. So, colleagues, listen, thank you so much for today. I really appreciate kind of you joining us, asking such brilliant questions, clarifying, giving us your own thoughts and ideas about how these things are taken forward. And also just thanks to colleagues who have been on the panel today, Lydia, Roisin, Pete, and Nicole. Again, grateful for your time. But colleagues, thank you so much for your time. I know December is such a busy time for everyone, and therefore we're very grateful that you've given us your time this afternoon. This is recorded and therefore will be available afterwards. So thanks again, colleagues. Have a good evening. And I hope you get a bit of a rest across the December period, whatever that might be. Thanks all.